Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The Russiagate hoax lives on. The sequel has just been released, starring, of course, Donald Trump, but also now Bernie Sanders. Indeed, Russiagate has achieved cult-like status. Also, Turkey on the ropes in Syria. Cross-talking some real news, I'm joined by my guest here in Moscow, Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst and editor at InnosMe Internet Media Project. And in London, we cross to Marcus Papadopoulos. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let me go to London first. Marcus, we have all of this going on in the United States with the presidential election and Mike Bloomberg and Bernie Sanders and Russiagate. But meanwhile, in Syria, a lot is happening. It's very, very dangerous. It could internationalize the war again. So what my question is to you, and it centers on Idlib, what in the world is Turkey trying to pull off there? It is breaking all of its agreements, and it's making the situation worse when the war is finally coming to an end. Marcus in London.
Let me set the scene, Peter, by saying that Turkey and Russia are traditional foes.
Yep.
And if anyone is in doubt of this, I would refer them to how Turkey aided Islamist, separatist militants, not just in Chechnya, but also in Dagestan and Ingushetia during the 1990s. Also, despite the handshakes and smiles between Erdogan and Putin, Turkey and Russia are involved in a proxy war with each other today in Syria, similar to how Soviet and American leaders would meet each other when their countries were involved in proxy wars with each other in Vietnam and Afghanistan. Now, turning to Idlib, Turkey overstretched itself when it involved itself illegally in Syria. And the turning point for Turkey in Syria was when the Turks shot down a Russian fighter aircraft at the end of 2015. Because ever since then, Russia has significant leverage over Turkey when it comes to Syria. Let us not forget that it was Erdogan who flew to St. Petersburg at the beginning of 2016 to meet with Putin and to profusely apologize to Putin for the shooting down of that Russian aircraft. Why, Peter, did Erdogan do that? First, because of the serious, severe Russian sanctions that Putin placed on the Turkish economy. But there was another reason. If you have a look in the immediate period after the Turks shot down that Russian aircraft, up until Erdogan flew to St. Petersburg to apologize to Putin, there was a spike in the amount of Turkish soldiers and police officers who were dying in combat with the PKK. And the PKK and Russia are traditional friends. So I will leave it to Crosstalk's viewers to draw their own conclusions on that matter. But it is suffice to say that today, Turkey in Syria is at the mercy of Russia. We saw in recent days how the Russian Air Force destroyed Turkish tanks and Turkish soldiers without one word of condemnation from Ankara. Finally, Peter, I would submit this to you. Turkey has been left on its own in Syria by America to face Russia on its own, similar to how the Americans left the British and the French in Egypt to face the Soviet Union during the Suez Canal crisis.
You know, Dima, there's been some noise being made. Pompeo is backing Turkey's claims and on goals, all that, but they haven't really done anything yet. And I doubt Donald Trump will pursue that as he's so close to his re-election bid here. But Marcus Papadopoulos is really right. Ever since Russia was invited in to end the conflict in Syria, and this is essentially a conflict against terrorism and terrorists and countries around the world that support terrorists. Turkey is one of them. There's a lot at stake here. Is this, again, one of Erdogan's bluffing games? Because if it is, maybe it works at home. It hasn't worked with the Russians at all. And I would even say the Russian side has shown enormous restraint and patience. Go ahead.
Well, I would say that this is just one more of Erdogan's mistakes. It was a mistake in the first place to go against Syria. He had a good relationship with President Assad up until 2011. They went sailing together. Let me remind you that this was one of the reasons why the world kind of acquiesced to Erdogan staying in power longer than any previous Turkish prime minister. His policy in the early 2000s was good relations with all the neighbors, even with Armenia. Unfortunately, he detoured from that policy later on, and Syria was the main disaster, I think. But I would add one detail to what Marcus has just said. So the sequence of events. In September 2015, Russian Air Force starts operating in Syria. Let me remind you that before that, for 11 months, the so-called coalition had been bombing the so-called Islamic State, ISIS. And ISIS continued to expand somehow.
Well, they didn't, Dima. What they did is they bombed the infrastructure of Syria to create a failed state in a literal sense. They didn't fight ISIS.
That was a very strange bombing, which somehow was accompanied by strengthening of the Islamic State. After Russia moved in September 2015, the Islamic State started to shrink. And now it's almost non-existent, thank God. But, in the end of 2015, the downing of the Russian plane, the souring of relations. In summer 2016, the failed coup attempt against Erdogan, which is very mysterious. I will not make any claims, but after that coup, somehow Mr. Erdogan is very distrustful of the United States and a lot more positive about Russia, even though warming of relations started before the coup.
But that's what makes this, let me go back to Marcus, this is what makes it really such a murky situation here, because Erdogan has got himself again in a situation, he's boxed himself in because he doesn't want to lose face here. And the Russians, back last December, negotiated a dignified withdrawal to actually clean up the remnants of these terrorist cells in Idlib. And he's broken his word again. How do we get out of this quagmire without a major conflict? Marcus?
Well, let me just add to the previous comments, Peter, by saying it wasn't in the interests of France to invade Russia in 1812. It was in the interests of Napoleon. If we take the current situation in Syria, it wasn't in the interests of Turkey to involve itself in Syria, but it was the interests of Erdogan to involve Turkey in Syria. But where do we go from here? Well, it's very, very clear that the Syrian army is advancing rapidly in Idlib, and backed by the Russian military and also backed by the Iranian military. It is almost over for Erdogan's dreams of extending Turkish influence into the Middle East by keeping hold of parts of Syria, especially because the Americans have told him in no uncertain terms that they are not going to come to his rescue. So the Turkish army is not going to engage itself in a military confrontation with the Russian military because it would be slaughtered. It would be military suicide for it to do so. So I think the Turks publicly are saying that they will resist the so-called aggression of the Syrian government and the Syrian army. But in private, they will be saying very different words to the Russians. Erdogan now needs a dignified retreat.
Okay, but Marcus, we've already been there. We've already been in that situation, Dima, we've already been in that situation. I mean, what now? Because, like I said, Russia certainly doesn't want to get into a major conflict with Turkey, since relations between the two countries have improved immensely over the last 3 or 4 years.
Russia will not get into that conflict for a very simple reason. Erdogan was in a much better position to attack and basically occupy Syria in 2012. All the Western world was against Syria. Mr. Sarkozy convened the so-called Friends of Syria, summit in which all the Western countries took part, dozens of countries. So if he didn't attack then, or rather his proxies tried and they failed, he knows he's going to fail now because Idlib is just a small part of Syrian territory. The government controls 90% of Syria, so he's in a much worse situation right now.
But his real dilemma is this, two things. Number one, as the Syrian army moves to regain control of all of its sovereignty, including the illegal occupation the Americans have there, you're going to have these terrorist cells. They only have one place to go, Dima, north.
Absolutely.
To Turkey. So he cultivated them, protected them, armed them, moneyed them. But now when the game is over, where do they go? They're not going to surrender to Assad and his forces. They're going to have one escape route where they came from.
Absolutely.
Okay?
But there's also...
I'm sorry, and the civilians.
And don't forget about Libya. You know, the Libyan people already very unfortunate after their help from the Western countries to establish democracy there.
These countries need less help from the West.
You know, their next misfortune is going to be the Idlib terrorists coming to them. Basically, Erdogan said that he's going to transport some of them to Libya. I think that would be a solution for him because these people are dangerous inside Turkey. But so Erdogan made a mistake on every step of the way. But his main mistake was he was not resolute enough in his opposition to the United States. He took the decision, buy S-400 missiles from Russia. Well, stay with it. But, you know...
And then we have South Stream, Turk Stream, we have that. That's a very important thing.
He always wants to, have his apple and eat it. You know, he always wants to play Russia against the United States and the West against Russia. And he always fails because the modern West is totalitarian. It doesn't forgive unfaithfulness. He was unfaithful to them with S-400s. They're not going to forgive it, you know. They're going to go after him until the end. That's why the West is totalitarian now. It doesn't forgive. So Russia understands it very well. So if you look at the speeches of Putin about the situation in Idlib and in Syria, if you look at the statements from the foreign ministry, okay, the defense ministry is pretty, defensive. They're military people. They say that the terrorists get artillery support from Turkey. They're telling the truth. Why is the foreign ministry more soft-spoken? We know that the West is not going to support him. Yep. And he is going to bluff for some more time and then withdraw.
That's what he's good at here. Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you for joining in this part of the program. We're going to go to a short break now, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with RT. Get a picture. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. And now we're joined by Alexander Mercouris in London. He is a writer on legal affairs as well as editor-in-chief of TheDurant.com. Alex, welcome to the program here. Well, we have the sequel. Russiagate lives on. I thought it was in traction, but no, it has new life, and it's the same figures in the swamp in the intel community that tells us it's alive and kicking. And then in the sequel, as you've well noticed, Bernie Sanders is playing a very important, if not leading role. So in one way, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders have to share the stage in equal terms. I have to say that I am aghast by this. I thought we'd been through it enough times, but it seems to be the only thing that keeps the political establishment and the media together on their war against Donald Trump when it's, 250-odd days out for a general election, presidential election. Go ahead, Alex. Go ahead.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what did they say? That, history repeats itself. The first time was tragedy. The second time was farce. Now it's repeating itself as farce followed by further farce, because this is completely farcical. We now have both Donald Trump, the leader of the right in the United States, and Bernie Sanders, the leader of the left in the United States, and Russia supposedly is helping and manipulating both. I mean, it's so crazy that, one wonders, have people in the United States taken complete leave of their senses? I mean, it is on that level of total absurdity. And consider, we have the New York Times promoting the myth of Russian help for Donald Trump. We have the Washington Post promoting the myth of Russian help for Bernie Sanders. It's the two newspapers of record, the two big traditional newspapers, that are being drawn out to pull this sort of game. Now, the other thing I have to say is, never give up, apparently, on a failed strategy. It didn't work with Donald Trump. So what do? You try again. You actually expand it. And I'm hearing that Bernie Sanders is doing very well in Nevada.
Yes.
So
Well,
it's obviously not working.
yeah, okay, well,
you still carry on.
That's exactly where I wanted to go. I just wanted to also stress, Dima, to our viewers, again, based on anonymous sources, okay?
Yes.
Of course, okay. But, Dima, this is all happening for a reason, and I'll give you my scenario here. Mm-hmm. You had the conviction and sentencing of Roger Stone.
Yes.
For the pushers, people that support and back this conspiracy theory, this ridiculous hoax, they needed that conviction and sentencing to legitimize
at least one of them.
One of them, and then we have this week coming up. We have the extradition trial of Julian Assange being tied to WikiLeaks being tied to Russia, and now we have this. And against Bernie Sanders, and the reason why they're doing it against Bernie Sanders because he's winning. Mm-hmm. He's winning.
Yes,
he got more than 50% in Nevada. That is an astounding outcome. This is all connected together. That's why they're resurrecting it.
Well, there's only one thing that is more destructive than the hostility of the mainstream media in the United States. That is their love. They poured so much love on Joe Biden that now Joe Biden is losing despite his huge financial support and the media support. Why? They loved him so much, they kept talking that he had nothing to do with Burisma. And finally, tens of millions of Americans got to know the name of that Ukrainian company very well. And I think it basically destroyed Joe Biden's campaign. But again, coming back to what you just said, well, I think that Sanders, this campaign about his involvement with Russia is so absurd. Only he can destroy his chances. When he said, my message to Russia is stay out of American election. Well, my message to him is don't be a nincompoop, Don't push the same theories that stole your chance to be nominated in 2016.
Alex, one of the things I find very interesting in looking at the coverage of these allegations from these anonymous sources, it seems to me they're like living in a time capsule. Bernie Sanders visited Moscow on his honeymoon. Actually, I think it was he came during the Soviet Union. There was a sister city thing. I think it was Moscow and a city in Vermont. I mean, there was a reason for him to be here. He happened to be having his honeymoon here at the same time. But they're trying to stretch this out as if Russia is still a communist country. They're making this really weird connections, and that's something that is made 30 years ago. But for the media, it's still the same narrative. And in their minds, because nothing has ever changed in the country I've lived in for 30 years, it must be the same. And the same Bernie, the same commie, is now getting support from the Kremlin. From the Kremlin, yeah. Kremlin. I mean, it shows any lack of depth of knowledge. Go ahead.
Well, there's absolutely no knowledge. I mean, this is one of the things that came across for me very clearly throughout Russiagate, and right at the very center of the US intelligence community world, there is a basic failure of knowledge about Russia. Yeah. And can I just say, Russia is in some ways the victim in all of this, because it has been constantly blamed by the US political establishment, the militant center, as I think somebody called it, of the United States, for whatever goes against the establishment. So if the left does well, that's Russia's fault. If the right does well, that's Russia's fault. And Russia is constantly used in this way in American partisan struggles. And the result is that Russia gets sanctioned, Russia gets criticized, its political leaders get demonized, and the whole prospect of improved relations between the United States and Russia to extremely important countries, Russia, the world's other great nuclear superpower, that prospect gets indefinitely postponed. And Russian people, ordinary Russian people, are constantly caught in the crossfire. We saw that with Maria Butina. I mean, we've seen this again in Italy, where the Russian athletes were frisked just before they were due to involve themselves in an important race. There's no question at all, in my opinion, all these things are connected.
You know, Tim, again, these anonymous sources coming out of the intel community. Donald Trump was supposed to drain the swamp. He's being overwhelmed by the swamp to this day. I mean, this is, again, a continuation of the same strategy they had before the election, after the election, and it's just being badly being reinvented.
Well, I mean, if only Russia had been just a victim of all of this, I completely agree with Alexander that basically it's absurd. I mean, let me just quote a Republican senator, Chris Stewart, defending Trump against the accusations that he is a Russian agent. I'd challenge anyone to give me a real-world argument why Putin would rather have President Trump and not Bernie Sanders, Mr. Stewart said in an interview, citing Trump's, anti-tank weapons for Ukraine, expelling Russian diplomats.
Ending arms control agreements.
Ending arms control. So this is making the world less and less safe. If you want to be the president of the United States, you have to show hostility to Russia, the second next nuclear superpower. So it just destroys security on our planet. The American political life is destroying security. And not only American political life. I completely agree with Alexander that it's not just American nationalists or hawks. It's the militant center. You just mentioned Julian Assange. The European press, kind of feels obliged to pay at least lip service to supporting Julian Assange. Der Spiegel, the liberal German magazine, what is their headline on Assange's trial? Trump's America is against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange.
Not just
Trump's
Trump.
America. Was it Trump who made Assange stay in the Ecuadorian embassy in London? Was it Trump who imprisoned Bradley Manning and basically tortured him? No, it was the adorable liberal, Mr. Obama. It was in the times when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. But these people, the so-called liberals in Europe and in the United States, they want us to have blank spots in our memory. They want to destroy all the things, all the positive things connected to Russia, and they want to stress all the negative things. And they forget, these German and French and British liberals, they forget that Russia was the only country that dared to give political asylum to Edward Snowden. None of them had the courage to do it.
It's not the first time liberals have amnesia here. Let me go back to Alexander. One of the things I find really kind of comical, never been able to understand, is that why would the Kremlin have a preference either way? I mean, because it's just going to be more hostility. It doesn't make any difference. I find it just really comical that they're scheming about supporting this side against that side and maybe support both of them against each other. I mean, this is an assumption that is never given any kind of serious thought. Go ahead, Alexander.
Well, that's right, because of course the Kremlin doesn't have a preference. It understands perfectly well that it is actually disastrous for Russia to interfere in American politics. That's why, one important reason, by the way, why I have always been extremely skeptical about the whole Russiagate conspiracy theory, which after multiple investigations has proved to be, the evidence for it has been threadbare and bitterly contested. So why would the Russians try and manipulate the American electoral process when the only result has been that relations between the United States
get worse.
and Russia just get worse? So why would they do it? I'm sure they're not doing it. And I'm sure that all of this is purely a product of American partisan politics, which unfortunately have now resulted in a situation where if the establishment candidate loses, be it Joe Biden, be it Pete Buttigieg, be it Mike Bloomberg, it's always the fault of the Russians. It's never the American people exercising their own democratic.
Well, the problem is that the political elites in the United States abhor democracy and they have contempt for the voter. That's all the time we have. Many thanks to my guests here in Moscow and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, Crosstalk rules.